All right. Good evening and thanks for coming. Sorry to interrupt the conversation. I believe some of you have a limited time. I think you all know who I am. I'm Rob Rohrbaugh. I kind of started this epic thing a little while ago. And really, I have to thank a couple of people here, Paul Van Buren and Ed Trumper, that have gotten in touch with Senator Erdman and some of the other ones here that I believe you know. So I'm grateful to have this opportunity. Thank you for expressing your opinions yesterday, your votes up or down. I'd like to introduce an economist that I think most of you know. And, I don't want to take very much time because he's the man of the hour. He's going to talk a little bit about economics in Nebraska and then throw it open for questions. Art?
You ready?
Dr. Art Laffer.
If you don't mind, I'll just stand right here, and I'm just here to help you tonight if I can. I've been working with states forever and ever and ever, but I do want to tell Ed over there, Ed Trumper, do not name one of your children never. I mean, it's the funniest thing, I'm sorry. And coming in here, it was really sort of fun for me. It brought back a lot of memories. I noticed this building is the Nebraska building, the big law center. And I knew Senator Hruska really well, long ago. I was in the White House from 1970 to 1972. In fact, I was on the first trip to China not only before Nixon, but before Kissinger. I went with George Shultz and John Ehrlichman in Air Force Two. And we had Todd Hollins was our front man, did all the arrangements. And then we had a secretary on the plane who was Jana Hruska, the governor, the senator's daughter, which is sort of fun. So it's really a nice little thing here. Let me, if I can, what I'd like to do is just start off with Nebraska. I'm not going to talk about Nebraska per se very much. Since 1960, there have been 11 states in the United States that have introduced an income tax. Since 1960, the first one was West Virginia. That was in 1961. The last one was Connecticut in 1991. That was Lowell Weicker. In the middle there was Maine put in an income tax, Rhode Island put in an income tax, New Jersey put in an income tax, Pennsylvania put in an income tax, Ohio put in an income tax, Michigan put in an income tax, so did Illinois, so did Indiana, and so did Nebraska. Two of them put in an income tax and a sales tax almost together. You have that fine distinction as well. You were able to put both of them in at the same time to really do about as much damage as you possibly can be done to an economy. You exceeded everyone's expectations. If you look at these 11 states, what I did, and this is my book, The Wealth of States, and I said The Fall from Grace. This is my first chapter, The Fall from Grace. If you look at those 11 states, and what I did was I took those 11 states and I took the 5 years before they introduced the income tax. Okay? I then took the last 5 years, okay, the most recent 5 years, and I looked at all the major metrics of the state, the population of the state. I looked at the gross state product. I looked at employment. I looked at all of these variables, including tax revenues. You with me on this? So I looked at the 5 years before they introduced the income tax, and looked at their population relative to the rest of the nation, relative to the other 39 states. You follow me? And then I looked at the most recent year relative to the rest of the nation. Let me go through these 11 states. Each and every one of these 11 states declined dramatically relative to the rest of the nation. Now, with one exception. Their economies collapsed, their populations collapsed. I have the numbers here for Nebraska. Nebraska, I don't have them. Yeah, I do. I have Nebraska here. In population, now this is as of 2015, Nebraska's population relative to the rest of the nation dropped by 31%. Their gross state product dropped by 20%. And tax revenues, state and local tax revenues, dropped by 15% relative to the rest of the nation. And Nebraska's not the worst of that group. I mean, you've got a state like New Jersey, which in 1965 had neither sales tax nor income tax. They put in both. New Jersey at that time was the fastest growing state in the nation. People from everywhere were moving into that state. I mean, just amazing moving in, and they had a budget surplus. Just before Chris Christie took office as governor, you know, with what you got, call it, what is it? Just before Chris Christie, they had the highest property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, I mean, across the board, and the state was the slowest growing state in the nation. People were leaving like rats out of a sinking ship, and they had a huge budget deficit as well. This is the common pattern. This is the story of Nebraska and 10 other states. And may I just say that this is a disaster story. And when I heard what you guys were thinking about doing, I can't tell you how excited I was. I mean, it's really a very exciting thing here. When you look at the taxes, the changes you're talking about here in the state. I was very involved in something called Proposition 13 in California. That was in 1978. I worked very closely with Howard Jarvis and Paul Gann after Prop 13. Now, Prop 13, what it did was it said no property tax in the state of California can exceed 1% of that asset's market value, period. It cannot exceed 1% of that. And it cannot, property cannot increase its taxes more than 2% a year unless there's a transaction. If there's a transaction, then you get a new property base for the property, and then you start again. It goes up to 1%. You follow me on this? If you look at what happened in California, I mean, this proposition was opposed by the unions, especially the teachers union, because property taxes in California funded cities, counties, and local districts. It did not fund the state at all. And if you look at it, it was opposed by the teachers union, by other unions there. It was opposed by the Democratic Party in California. Oh, by the way, it was opposed by the Republican Party in California. And not only was opposed by the unions, but the Small Business Association opposed it vigorously. Not only did the Small Business Association oppose it vigorously, but the Round Table opposed it vigorously as well. Every business group did, every labor union and both parties opposed it. There was just one small group that liked it. Citizens. Yeah, it's a shocking thing. And in fact, when they did the polls afterwards, most of the teachers union people voted for it, even though their livelihoods were dependent upon it. If you look at what happened, go back to 1978, look at what happened. In the next 10 years, California grew by a Massachusetts. Each and every year we grew by a San Francisco. I mean, California just took off as this rocket ship in economic growth prosperity. Our unemployment rate was way above the national average, 2.5 percentage points above the national average. It collapsed in weeks to being equal to the last national average, or even a little bit lower. Housing prices, you wouldn't believe this, but in the mid-1970s, California's median home price was a little bit below the national average. By 1990, it was double the national average. I mean, the incredible prosperity. I can take you through some of these. Now, there are some states, and I know you're talking about sales taxes. I can't hit on Nebraska on sales taxes, but let me say, I've just been working with Missouri. I just did a big study on Missouri, a really heavy, deep dive on Missouri. By the way, every state desperately needs a really deep dive. Missouri has 3 years ago had 2,339 separate sales tax jurisdictions in its state. Say that again. Had 2,339 separate sales tax jurisdictions in its state. In each of those jurisdictions, the jurisdictions there had up to 8 separate authorized taxing entities where they layer on top of that. Right? The average, I think, 4.5 actually imposed sales tax on average. So you had 2,339 separate sales tax jurisdictions. You had taxing authorities up to 8, but on average 4.5. If you look at the product sales tax schedules, I think there were 15 separate product categories available for sales tax in Missouri. You had groceries, and you had restaurant food, and you had farm equipment. I mean, there were just all these separate categories for that. So you had 2,339 separate jurisdictions. You had up to 8 separate taxing authorities. You had 15 separate categories of sales with sales tax schedules. And just to make it rounded out nicely. There were 5 separate categories of purchasers, depending on whether you were 501c3 or there were all these different purchase things there. All right, so just to summarize, Missouri, 2,339 separate sales tax jurisdictions, up to 8 separate taxing authorities in each jurisdiction, 15 categories of products that were subjected to the sales tax, and 5 separate purchasers categories as well. And then the legislature in Missouri had the infinite wisdom to put that into the Constitution. Now, can you imagine the problems they have in Missouri? We need a constitutional amendment to be able to change any of those categories. Now, I was sitting with Mike Parsons that had lunch with him about 3 months ago. Do any of you know Mike? Wonderful. And Greitens was elected governor, and Mike was lieutenant governor. They didn't run on the same ticket together. They just both were elected. Greitens had this scandal, so he was thrown out of office, and Parsons came in. And I was trying to explain this to Mike at lunch in the governor's mansion there, and all I could do was see him go. It's terrible. You've got a problem here. Your problem is serious, and it is a real taxing problem. And I will just throw it open there for you. I mean, I'll talk about any of these other things you want to talk about. Yes, sir.
How long did California last before their tax, 1% tax went by the wayside and went back up?
Well, it did. It's still the only thing that's survived all of the attacks. California's Prop 13 is still fully in effect. You cannot raise taxes on property in California. And they just had a big one trying to get a 2-tier business and residential separation, as they call it, 2-tier.
How do they value property? Do they value it?
It's market value and how much. You can't have an increase in your tax bill more than 2% per year unless you sell your house.
If you sell it, do they try to recapture any of that?
No, there's no recapture, but the new basis is the new price. That's the market value. And then from then on, it's 1% of that new market value goes on, and it goes on for them.
So how do they pay for education? And
Yeah, no, they just, within a year and a half, property tax revenues were higher than they had been before. Now, let me tell you where they were before. If you look at total property taxes relative to market value, prior to Proposition 13, that number came out about 2.7% of market value. So we cut it from 2.7% to 1% in 1 minute. We literally just dropped that day. That gap, which was a huge gap, was overcome in a year and a half because of that mistake just going boom.
the valuations went up so much.
But you can't even mean the valuations because that 1% was at market value at the time. But development, growth, all of these other things that occur, it was amazing. Now, I spent a lot of time with Jerry Brown, who was one of my dearest friends, and as some of you may know, in 1992, I did Jerry Brown's camp economics for his presidential race when he ran against Bill Clinton. And what Jerry Brown did, he really did a lot to really make sure we won the battle on Prop 13. He found everyone was saying they're going to lose all these revenues, the schools would be closed, the libraries would be closed, oh my God, there'd be no police there. John Kenneth Galbraith sent me a little toy red fire engine. You remember Galbraith, the social guy? He sent me a little fire engine. He said, "Dear Art, here's a little fire engine for you that you can share with people in California while you take away all the real ones." You know, and what happened is that, on that, Jerry Brown did a search of all the state budgets. Now remember, Prop 13 did not affect the state at all. It just affected the local governments. He found about $4 billion worth of funds in the states that were sort of squirreled away. So once he announced that, all of the fears of all the police being stopped and everything else, they disappeared. Jerry Brown did all of the assessments, sent out the assessments of new homes a month before Proposition hit the ballot, so everyone saw how much their property taxes were going to go up. So we won the election in a landslide. That night, he called me. He said, "Art, I'd like you to be up here in Sacramento tomorrow morning, first flight." I said, "Okay, I'll get a ticket." He said, "Don't worry, I've got one for you." He had one for me. I went up there and met with his cabinet for 3 days. Ray Davis was his chief of staff back then. Dick Silverman was the head of finance, treasury. And what he did, and it was amazing, was he took about $4 billion of state funds and did a subvention the cities, counties, and local districts pro rata to the tax revenues they would have lost from that. And that subvention made it through easily. And by the time you got to 2 years out, the state and local governments were having more revenues than they otherwise would. I mean, it's amazing how fast these responses go. And, you know, just if I can say to you, economics is all about incentives. That's all it is. It's not liberal, it's not conservative, it's not left-wing, it's not right-wing, it's not Republican, it's not Democrat. Economics is all about incentives. And tax policy changes people's incentives. And when they change their incentives, they change their behavior big time. And if you look at what's happened here to this state, your revenues are down relative to the rest of the nation from what they were before the time you adopted the income tax and the sales tax. Your revenues are down. Now, think of the logic that would be in this august group here today before you adopted your income tax and your sales tax. What would the discussion be? You'd have a couple of freaks like me who would say, well, if you do that, you're going to lose people to the rest of the nation and blah, 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 blah. And then the others would say, we need better roads. You know, we need schools to be improved. I mean, come on, guys. What do you want to do? You know, walk down a dirt road to a library that's been closed for 20, I mean, you know, so this is always the argument going on there between public services. So what I did with all 11 of your states, including Nebraska, I said, these people who voted for these taxes and really did it so that they could get better public services. They weren't bad people. They were great people. And they just thought they needed more. So I looked at all of the major public services provided by each of these 11 states. Now, I use full-time equivalent employees, which we have records of, unbelievably in-depth records of that. I'll give you the one that I use, which is about 50 to 55% of every state's budget, and that's education. And I had two measures of education. I'm going to give you the second measure because I don't remember it. But there are two. One is inputs, which is full-time equivalent employees in the education industry, and then you've got full-time equivalent employee teachers on the ground teaching and all that. The other thing I looked at, which was the output. The Department of Education in the United States has tests about every 3 or 4 years, which are called the NAEP scores, economic progress, I can't remember, National Economic Progress, NAEP test, yeah, Association of, yeah, progress. And they look at 4th grade and 8th grade, math and reading, all right? And we have those scores so we can rank all these, and again, I looked at all these states relative to the rest of the nation. 2 of the states improved by a little bit. Of the others, the 9 states, they declined in education test scores relative to the rest of the nation. You paid all the money for it, you got all the harm and damage done by it, and you didn't get the money to have better schools. And that is the truth. Now, your decline wasn't as bad as some states. You want to know, I mean, just imagine West Virginia doing that in 1960. Have you ever been to West Virginia? You can't make it poorer. I mean, yes, you can. They did. I mean, you look at Illinois. You look at Connecticut. Connecticut was the second fastest growing state in the nation up until 1991. Lowell Riker put that tax in there. Connecticut now is one of the slowest growing states in the nation. I mean, just collapsed. New Jersey. I mean, do you see what what's happening there in New Jersey? I mean, I could go through all in my home state of Ohio. It's catastrophic what's happening. Ogilvy in Illinois, if you've seen what's happening in Illinois. I mean, Illinois was incredible. It was the shoulders that held America, not anymore. But the revenue feedback, you know, I'm going to read you a little one here, just sort of on my adopted home state. That things, I think, if I color in a couple of my teeth with licorice, they think I'm more enraged. No, that's not tell anyone in Tennessee I said that. I'm just going to read you a little one here. I titled this, Who Says You Can't Have Low Taxes, Great Services, and Fiscal Soundness? Not Tennessee. Now remember, this is a little dated. These aren't all up to date. These are just vignettes that I've done on the work I did. When I got there, we got rid of the death tax, we got rid of the gift tax, and we got rid of the unearned income tax, because I came in and got weren't prepared for it. Tennessee has no earned income tax. Tennessee has eliminated its gift and estate tax. That was in 2016. Tennessee is phasing out its unearned income tax in 2022. They've already got rid of it. Tennessee has the 9th lowest property tax ratio of any state in the nation. Tennessee has the 3rd lowest total tax burden of all the U.S. Now, if you look at, yes?
Right, I don't want distraction from what you're telling us now. We all have to go pretty soon. Maybe if there's another couple of quick questions.
Sure, I'll be glad to do questions, sir. By the way, we have surplus of the fastest growing state, best credit rating of any state in the nation, and the biggest improvement in educational test scores of any state in the nation, in every category. Yes?
The elephant in the room is, have you looked at our proposed consumption tax?
Yes.
And what it would do to revenues, tax revenues, and the economics of this?
Yeah. Let me tell you that I would not have designed the tax this way, but I've done it in that tax framework for a number of states. I proposed one for California long ago, which is what you want to have in a state is you want to have the lowest possible tax rate on the broadest possible tax base. So you provide people with the least incentives to evade, avoid, or otherwise not report taxable income. And you also want the least loopholes in there so where they can put their income and not pay taxes. That's what you want. Now the proposal I did, I'll come back to yours. You have some things in yours that I wouldn't have put in. I wouldn't have exempted education spending. I wouldn't have had a rebate. I would just have the lowest rate on the broadest base. That's the way I would have done it. This is a big improvement from what you got because of what you have. If you look at those rates, you can get those rates really, really low. If you tax two things, I tax one is net sales, which is if you're Democrat, it's called value-added tax. If you're a Republican, they call it net sales tax. And personal income tax. Flat one, so you start paying the tax on the first dollar you earn to the last dollar you earn. No gradation, nothing else. If you do that, you can replace all state taxes on a very low rate. I mean, really low rate. If you got really the broad base, you probably can do it 7%, 6.5%. Can you imagine what would happen in Nebraska? It would be amazing. I mean, if you look at your migration pattern, I think I got that map there, but the states you've lost money to, you know, the IRS gets tax returns and they compare this year with last year, and where you filed last year and where you filed this year, so they know all the people who've left Nebraska to go to other states. They know all the people from other states who moved to Nebraska. I did that little map there. I think there were only 3 states. He's getting to be very much. And it's not stopping. It's just going. So when you start adding these numbers up over time, it'll pay for itself clearly and in not very long period. Oh, thank you. You just see little Nebraska there, the little white one there? See all the red ones? That's the people you were losing money to. Now, there is one here, Hawaii, there is one person more has moved from Hawaii to Nebraska than has moved from Nebraska to Hawaii. And I think it must be a relative to Warren Buffett. I'm not just joking. Yes? Oh, you're the one who moved? No questions?
Any other questions?
I can take you through all sorts of stuff on all these different ones, Prop 2.5 in Massachusetts, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Northern Marianas. I've done all those tax reforms. Pete DuPont's Delaware. If you want to ask any of those questions, we have hard numbers on all of them. I've done an in-depth study for Kentucky. I can take you through Kentucky's property taxes, but I think you should have done before you ate. 155 separate property taxes in Louisville, Jefferson County.
Some people have to leave.
Yeah.
Senator, would you like to talk about our schedule in the morning?
Yeah.
Before this young lady leaves?
Yeah, I'll be available tomorrow until about noon. We have a meeting at 9:30, Art and I have a meeting tomorrow at 9:30 with the governor. Other than that, he will be available. So if you have questions or whatever, we'll make sure we can he'll be around in the Capitol tomorrow, we can visit with him there. I would ask him this question. You have done studies on taking away the income tax from those states that have income tax. You see what the economic advantage is. Can you give us in a percentage, or can you estimate what the advantage is just by removing income tax?
Sure. I mean, I've got here, in this same thing, I've got the one. There are 9 states with no earned income tax. There are 9 states with the highest earned income tax rates, all right? What I've done is taken those 9 states with no earned income tax, taken their 10-year moving average on all the major metrics, population, tax revenues, public services, gross state product, all of that, and compared it with the highest tax rate states. The 0 earned income tax rate states beat the living chambers out of the high states every single year for the last 50 years, not with one exception. I mean, it's just incredible evidence, you know, that he said, let me see if I can just get that.
Well, Art's looking that up.
Here it is, right here. You see, this is the 0 income tax rate, this is population growth, this is 0, and this is the highest tax rate state, and this is gross state product growth. And every year it's by a huge amount, and that's just compounds and compounds.
The other question I have, Art,
Yeah.
as we presented this yesterday, I have a lot of good questions. The biggest question that is the one we overcome is, it is such a big step, and such a big change. How do we get our hands around accepting that change and moving forward, making the decision not have property tax or income tax or sales tax? How do
Yeah,
we do that?
I'll do 2 conversations with you. One I had with, I'm just telling here, with Jay Nixon of Missouri. I don't know if any of you remember who Jay Nixon was. He was the governor of Missouri before Greitens. Good guy, Democrat, fairly liberal Democrat. We were sitting down, he'd invited me to come spend time with him, and I did. He had his finance chief there, he had his chief of staff, and we went through all of this stuff for a couple of hours. And he used to be Attorney General, really smart guy. And he got all of this stuff, and at the end of it, he said, you know, Arthur, tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up in Nashville, Tennessee, and I'm going to be still sitting here in Jeff City. I've got 2 years left in office. I know I can muddle through for the next 2 years without a catastrophe. If I do your thing, I just don't feel that same way. Now, he just said, I just can't do it. I just can't do it myself. He had all the doubts. But he did have a problem. It's called Ferguson. That ruined his career. But we had it with Fife Simonton to allay the fears with Fife. Now, Fife was elected governor of Arizona in 1990, I think it was. Fife was a dear friend of mine before he became governor. He wanted to eliminate the income tax. You know, it was right on the back of Babbitt, Beacom, and Balfour were the 3 preceding governors who raised the highest tax rate to a little over 8% income tax. He had a budget director who was an accountant, and just what he's supposed to be. And the budget director was panicked about not having enough money for the schools and all this other sort of stuff. So what we tried to do was do it in a slow movement, 1 year at a time for 8 years, to finally get rid of the income tax. So the first year we did it, we looked at the results, the revenues came in, it was nice. So we were able to do the second year, we got to the 5th year, and then Mike was indicted on federal charges and convicted, and then out of office, and that stopped there. We got it down to about 3.5% of the income tax. We would have cleaned it out by the end of the time. Perfect, every number in there. What I would suggest you do is I would suggest you start the rate higher than it should be, so you guarantee you have the revenues. And when the numbers come in nicely, you guarantee that those numbers reduce the rate, period. So every surplus you have, you reduce the rate, and you'll see what happens. You don't want something like Tibor in Colorado. Tibor is a taxpayer's bill of rights. Do all of you know the Tibor? And supposedly if you raise too much money, it goes back to the taxpayers. Well, that's nonsense. It doesn't. What happens is when you have a surplus in the budget, right, the legislature then decides how it's distributed back to quote unquote taxpayers, like the school teachers. You know, it has no teeth whatsoever. So you need to make this thing too high a rate so you don't have any risk of getting caught without enough funds. And then as soon as that year's surplus in, you drop the rates down and you make sure it's all rate reduction, nothing is. And what you're gonna have to do with a lot of you, which is very difficult for a lot of you, is give up your special little ones there. We had that in 1986. It was Moynihan and Packwood. You know, I've been working with the president for all this time. It was the 86 Tax Act, and Moynihan and Packwood are sitting there in the room. It's called the Showdown at Gucci Gulch. They had a bottle of scotch and they didn't more than one. And they were just drunk as skunks. And they just said, let's get rid of all the deductions, exemptions, and exclusions and drop the rate. And we dropped the rate from 50% to 28%. We dropped the corporate rate from 46 to 34%. I mean, this place went crazy. Now, it was a very close political battle. I mean, it was really close. The Senate vote in favor of that bill was only 97 to 3. 3 senators voted against it. Simon from Illinois, Melchior, I think, from Montana, and 11 from Michigan. If you remember 11. Everyone else voted for us. Everyone. Teddy Kennedy, tall and pink, Bill Bradley. He voted. He loved it. He loved it. Al Gore, my neighbor, one of my best friends. If you get Al Gore's recent book called The Future, you can see my little blurb on it. I think he's a wonderful man. Just a great guy. I mean, we passed that. Look what happened in the U.S. when we did that. This is what you're doing. And may I say, you know, when looking at all of you tonight here, the Republicans and Democrats, this is what you were elected to do. This is your mission.